Pastors and leaders, let's answer 4 questions for setting up your church org chart. So if you've sort of been going through some of these leadership conversations, some of these leadership discussions for pastors using the Pursue God resources to create a discipleship culture, a mentoring culture in your church, then really the best way to think of your church org chart is as your own sort of professional mentoring tree. So the first question to ask is, who's in my first circle? Who are these first people that I need to mentor? And so we show those in red here, these red circles. Now, what I recommend, especially for a church that maybe doesn't have a big staff, maybe you're the only paid staff person, a great way to think of this is like this. You've got your pastoral team. Now, those would be, maybe traditionally you call that your elders, but I'm talking about working elders. Your group of guys that really get it. They understand what mentoring is about, or at least they want to understand what mentoring is about. So maybe it's small group leaders, some of your key leaders in your church that really want to get out there and be mentors, lead their small groups, lead their families. So that would be your pastoral team. Now, your pastoral team circle might have, a dozen people in it, depending on your org chart. It might not just be one person. It might have several people in that circle. Your second circle is your kids' church team. Again, that might have a couple of leaders, or maybe it just has your kids' church director in it, and that might be a circle of one person. And then your third circle is your youth team. Again, might be a couple of people, or maybe it's just your youth pastor or your youth director. Your next one is your worship team. Again, now the ones in your circle there, it might be 1 or 2 names. It's not everyone on all of your worship teams. We'll get to that. It's just 1 or 2 people. The worship team leader is important. A lot of times if that worship team leader doesn't understand the culture you're trying to create in your church, then it really causes problems for you down the road. And then that 5th circle is what we call your operations team. In this, again, it might be one sort of operational coordinator, a volunteer coordinator at your church. Depending on your church structure, you can learn more about what the operations team is from our perspective, but it's all those kind of the nitty gritty, the coffee team and the ushers and greeters and office team and people like that. So I would recommend that this represents your first circle. Again, it's not just necessarily one name in each of those circles. It might, depending on the circle, it might be a handful of names in a circle. It might be one director in that particular circle. But your next question then is, so what is our next topic and when are we going to talk about it? So this is kind of a sort of a scheduling and a methodology question. And of course, what I mean by that is if you go to the Pursue God resources, you have to remember that when you're having conversations with your leaders, if you don't make these conversations simple and reproducible, then you're not really going to be able to spread your influence beyond your first circle. So the simplest way to answer that question is to go to the ministry tools link, go down to teams and training, and you'll notice these first 3 teams really are your pastoral teams. Your pastoral team, your teaching team, and your small group team. That's all that first circle. Your kids' church team, that's your second circle. Your youth team, that's your third circle. Your worship team is your 4th circle, and your operations team is your 5th circle. So this is the most obvious answer to that second question, what conversation should we have? I would start with these conversations. So you sit down, for example, with your kids' church director, and you go through some of these training conversations. Schedule those conversations once a week, every other week, once a month, whatever your schedules allow for. And whether you're getting together face-to-face or even just having the conversation over the phone, you're using the FLEX method. Make sure you understand that you're using a reproducible method. You're finding that topic that you're going to talk about. So let's say, hey, let's go through KC principle number 1. You're using that resource to have that conversation. Make sure that you and your kids' church leader, that you're on the same page, that you have clarity on what the goal is, what the principles are for your kids' church training. So these are some of the first conversations that you want to have with your kids' church leader, right? Make sure you schedule those conversations, have whatever conversations you need to have. Make sure you're doing it simply, doing it reproducibly, because the whole point then is, now the next question is, really, you can probably see where we're heading is who is in my second circle. So now your second circle is your first circle's first circle, right? So the people in your second circle are the next people in the next generation of your organization. And you say, okay, so who are some of the people in that next generation? Because then the final question is simply, will my guys, my first circle, do what I'm doing? In other words, will they say, okay, so who are those people in my first circle? So the conversations that you have when you say, what's our next topic and when are we going to have the conversation? You're scheduling those conversations. You're using those clearly defined resources from pursuegod.org. Maybe you're writing some of your own conversations, but the point is you're doing it in a way, you're giving your first circle the tools to have those next conversations at the next level. Because your job isn't to have every conversation in the church. Your job is to have the conversations with your first circle and then to equip them and empower them to have the conversations with their first circle, which is your second circle. And really, this goes back to the second generation principle. That principle means you really, all you need to do, if you do it well, if you're having conversations and equipping conversations, and you're having those conversations with your first generation, your first circle, and you're teaching them and encouraging them and exhorting them and overseeing them as making sure that they're having the right conversations with their first circle, then really you're doing your part. You're creating something that can go viral. Because if you're teaching them to do what you're doing, which is to think through who's in my first circle, is to make sure you're using the methodology and the tools that you're providing for them as their leader, and making sure that they're asking the next question for their circle of influence, and they're challenging their circle of influence to have a circle of influence. What's happening is you're passing these conversations down. You only really have these 2 generations in mind, but if every generation has 2 generations in mind, you can sort of map out this tree and you can see how this really can go viral within your culture. And that's what a mentoring culture is all about, is you've got simple tools, simple expectations, you're using simple methodology, and you're having conversations and you're empowering people to have those conversations at the next level. Now, there's a lot to do with this conversation still. You probably need to go ahead and print out that worksheet that we have below this video and start thinking it through, start filling in names on your first circle. I would encourage you, pastors, to even start filling in some of the names for your second circle. Again, you're going to want to have that conversation with your first circle, but probably start thinking it through on your own and then encourage them to do the exact same thing that you're doing with them. So whatever you do, make sure that you're doing it in a way that's reproducible. That's how a mentoring tree works. That's how your church org chart can really start to make more sense and get formulated in your own mind. So you get clarity on the org chart and how you're going to pass information on, how you're going to schedule those meetings, whether it's going to be on the phone, whether it's going to be in leadership meetings. Make sure that you have that clarity, fill out that org chart, and then go through that with your first circle. And then you can equip them to do the same thing through the generations in your church.